Well, hello everyone. Very good afternoon from Singapore to today's webinar, Political Violence in Turbulent Times. My name is Michael Shearer. I'm Managing Director Asia Pacific for McLaren Applied, and I'm welcoming you all today in my capacity as Vice President of the British Chamber of Commerce here in Singapore. Thank you for joining us. Actually, in a previous life, I worked for the diplomatic service, working in a number of hotspots, reducing the potential for political violence and extremism. So it's going to be a fascinating session today. I'm delighted to welcome our fantastic panel of speakers who are going to explore how organizations can mitigate the impact of the turbulent and challenging times in which we are all living on their assets, their people, revenue streams in 2020 and beyond. So what I hope you're going to get out of this session are some current and past case studies and learnings from the panel, as well as some time for some Q&A on what I know is going to be an interactive and engaging session. So the final thing for me to do is to introduce your moderator for today, Julian Taylor. Warm welcome to you, Julian. Julian is Head of Crisis Management for Asia at Aon. He was instrumental in establishing the standalone terrorism insurance market as a direct response to the IRA attacks on London in 1993. He became one of the world's leading brokers within his class, having handled terrorism risk both prior and post the tragic events of 9/11. And in his current role, Julian leads Aon's crisis management practice for Asia. So thank you, Julian. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Very much appreciate the opportunity that the British Chamber have given us this afternoon to talk about a very relevant topic in today's world. We're going to specifically address the changing dynamic as a result of COVID-19 and the direct socio-economic impact that is having on businesses across Asia. We have four speakers. Our first speaker is Kit Dawnay. Kit is the Director of Research and Singapore Country Head at Steve Vickers Associates. He leads their research team dealing with pre-transactional investigations, financial crime inquiries, and political risk. Before Steve Vickers, Kit Dawnay worked for Aegis Defence Systems, focusing on anti-money laundering, including work on a threat assessment for a financial action task force regional body in West Africa, specifically on Asian risk. Before Aegis, Kit worked as a committee specialist at the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, managing inquiries into East Asia and South Asia, and on strategic export controls. He's also worked in parliamentary support with the United Nations Development Programme in Vietnam and as a financial journalist. So extremely well qualified for Southeast Asia topics. Our second panelist is Alexander Neill, who's an Executive Director of Alexander Neill Consulting. Alexander worked for the British and US governments in his early career, focusing on Asia Pacific security concerns. From 2005, he served as head of the Asia Security Programme at the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies in London. There, he developed a programme of research focusing on British policy concerns towards Asia's security. He had coordinated a number of Track 2 projects in Asia, including high-level dialogues in Beijing, Pyongyang, Taipei, and Tokyo. A graduate of London University School of Oriental and African Studies, he's a Chinese linguist and has published on Chinese security issues, but also has much wider interest and experience in Asia security, including counterterrorism issues, deterrent strategy, and cyber security. In 2013, he was appointed Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia Pacific Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, based here in Singapore, and was responsible for delivering the Shangri-La Dialogue Summit agenda and research projects focusing on Asia Pacific security issues, particularly on China and its relationships in the region. He established his consultancy very recently in early 2020. Our third panelist, Matt Bird, is a senior underwriter here in Singapore for political violence at Canopius Syndicate, Lloyd's of London. Matt started his insurance career in 1997 as a specie broker into the London market. Following an internal company move, Matt then spent time working on a wide range of insurance products such as political risk, project cargo, printers, E&O, prize indemnity, and event cancellation, among others. Since 2002, Matt has specialised in terrorism and political violence insurance, initially as a broker at Marsh, and since 2009 as an underwriter. Matt has been underwriting terrorism and political violence insurance in the Asia Pacific region since 2013 and joined the Canopius team at the beginning of 2019, specifically to expand their political violence presence in Asia. And finally, Carrie Huang, who's the underwriting manager for crisis management and special risks at AXA XL, which is a division of the AXA Group. Carrie has over 15 years experience in insurance and is currently an underwriting manager based in Singapore. Her major role is to grow war, terrorism and political violence insurance for AXA XL across Asia. She also has additional responsibilities in finding solutions, insurance solutions, I should say, for other products within the AXA XL crisis management and special risk class. She started her career as a broker at HSBC, based in South China and Hong Kong, mainly for financial lines. She joined XL Insurance and moved to Singapore in 2008 as a financial lines underwriter, then specialised in terrorism and political violence since 2013, when the Asia team was set up in XL. She also has broader crisis management knowledge, and hopefully we might see some of that in the conversations today. Those are the four panelists, and I think without any further ado, I'll hand over directly to Kit, who will take us through his first section of the presentation. Thank you, Kit.
Thank you very much, Julian, for the introduction. It's very kind. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's very good to be here and have an opportunity to present. My name's Kit Dawnay. I'm the Director of Research at Steve Vickers Associates. We're primarily a Hong Kong and Singapore-based business. We have been in the political risk and business risk mitigation business for quite some time. I'm just going to run through a short slide presentation. I intend to focus primarily on developments in Hong Kong, just as more of a case study, and then extrapolating out some of what I think this tells us about the broader region. Just as way of background, we're a risk business with three lines of business, led by Steve Vickers, who's been in this business for about 40 years now, here and in Hong Kong. If I could go to the next slide, please, Helen. We have three lines of business. The first is business risk, essentially the front end before it's gone wrong. Could we have the next slide, please, Helen? Corporate investigations, essentially putting the toothpaste back in the tube after it's gone wrong. And then the next slide, please, security and special risk, which is our special series of services essentially linked to kidnap and ransom, evacuations, these sorts of problems. Steve Vickers is our CEO. He's the former head of Kroll Asia. He was in the Royal Hong Kong Police for many years, and he now runs SVA, which is his current iteration. I've been in this business for about 17 years. I have a background in journalism, in government work, and also in working for a private military company. I'm now based here in Singapore, here for 4 years. I was in Hong Kong for 7.5 years before that. I've also done work in the Balkans and West Africa. I'm going to focus on Hong Kong. So I just thought it was a useful case study in terms of examining quite how political violence has changed the situation even prior to the outbreak of COVID earlier this year. So could I have the next slide, please, Helen? I think the first point to make about Hong Kong is that we've seen a return to stability of sorts. These bullet points run through the background. Essentially, the dispute arose because of an extradition law clumsily handled by the Carrie Lam government. which re-energized the opposition camp, which had been quite flaccid essentially by then, after the Occupy Central series of protests. But ire at police handling of crowds and a shooting on the 1st of October, I've pointed to a number of examples, but they're actually a good number. One is the Yuan Long incident, when unknown assailants in white t-shirts attacked student protesters. Another was a non-fatal shooting on the 1st of October, which then led to a very serious outbreak of violence with 2 university sieges in November last year. Essentially, this reinvigorated the protest movement very, very, very strongly, but in a different format. And the movement essentially sought to reclaim control of the political outlook in Hong Kong. It then sought to move into unions, looking ahead to legislative council elections which were scheduled for September this year, September 2020. Could I have the next slide, please, Helen? In early 2020, late 2019, the Beijing government essentially decided they had had enough. And they appointed a number of individuals whose appointment augured a new tough policy shift. Then COVID broke out in February 2019 or so, January, February 2019, which actually had a chilling effect on the protests. It created a sort of ceasefire of sorts because people were scared to go out on the streets. People weren't quite aware of quite how dangerous the virus was at that stage. I think we have a better sense now. This dampened down proceedings, but there were a number of small-scale bombings, and there was a sense that that could emerge at that time. And then the National People's Congress in China, most importantly, moved forward to pass a national security law in late May. This came in the wake of a seizure back of control of the Legislative Council. And since then, we've seen a much more constrained operating environment emerge in Hong Kong. So we've seen arrests, most prominently perhaps of Jimmy Lai of Next Media, but not alone, and a postponement in the LegCo elections for 1 year until September next year, 2021. Could I have the next slide, please? The response from outside has been instructive. So here we have a really interesting example of where political violence of a relatively limited geographical nature and also with reasonably constrained political aims, initially just the overturning of the Extradition Act, but then it broadened out into the 5 demands and all the rest, resulted in pushback internationally. And this is where it becomes important for international business, or more important for international business. You've had the US condemnation of the developments in Hong Kong, and most importantly, the passage of the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. And since then, we've seen a whole series of punitive measures imposed by the US and other states, the UK, Australia, Canada, and such like, of varying strength, but they've had quite a significant impact on business operations in Hong Kong. So the removal of the special trading status that Hong Kong was afforded previously, suspension of extradition arrangements, which probably unwittingly will be of as much assistance to triad societies and criminals as to anyone else, and the imposition of financial sanctions, initially on individuals and initially in relatively limited in nature. I think the key point I want to make here is that there's more to come. US rules under the Hong Kong Autonomy Act dictate that the State Department must prepare a list of new names for sanctioning by the 12th of October, so next week. And then Treasury has a month to put together a list of foreign financial institutions, both of which have assisted in limiting Hong Kong's autonomy. And this is really quite significant in terms of broader economic decoupling. There's quite a big question of who or what will be targeted, not least as Hong Kong is an arena for test of strength. We've been thinking, a number of options. Could be a big financial institution from the mainland, but doing that would essentially be very damaging in terms of financial relationship between the US and China, potentially with implications for Chinese holdings of treasuries. Or alternatively, you could go for a more middle standing entity, perhaps something that has received a lot of pressure recently for one or another reason in terms of providing information about protesters' accounts or what it may be. The question here is essentially how strong will the Americans go in? and what will be the implications for financial stability in Hong Kong. The obvious thing is the Hong Kong dollar peg is one potential higher end target, but you could go lower down the tier and just aim at a smaller banking institution just to sort of kill a chicken to scare the monkeys, so to speak. China is pushing back itself. And of course, in September this year, it put together, or it publicized its putting together of an unreliable entity list. It's not clear who or what is on the entity list. There's been a lot of names bandied about of prominent US companies, maybe foreign companies that have done things that the Chinese government is not happy with. But the long and short is that the business community in Hong Kong is increasingly caught between two stools. Could I move on to the next slide, please? So in summary, what we're seeing here is a changing constitutional settlement. I didn't dwell on this earlier, but the chief executive role is increasingly comparable to the governor role, I believe, in an ordinary Chinese province or autonomous region, while the head of the liaison office is essentially taking on de facto what would be seen as the party's secretary role. And this has implications for administration in Hong Kong and more broadly for the way that the jurisdiction should be treated by businesses and people operating there. And we're seeing a lot of closer integration to the Greater Bay region. My contention is that this essentially is pushing Hong Kong into a different kind of role where it assists Chinese companies in going overseas more rather than assisting Western companies in coming to China, which has arguably been its traditional role. Could I move on to the next slide, please? So this has a major impact on Hong Kong business, ranging from COVID, political exposure. The operational environment increasingly is comparable to that in mainland China. Compliance is an issue, and the question is, when does this become prohibitive rather than irksome, especially in the context of sanctions, financial instability? And the long and short is we need to plan here for, unfortunately, a further deterioration. And then on to the next slide. I just want to touch briefly on the broader business risks for the region. Increasingly, businesses may be being forced to choose. In the PRC, there's a lot more emphasis now on party committees in businesses, which will alter investment structures and make perhaps less attractive investing in the mainland. Politicization in the US in terms of pushback there, selective application of rules. I was thinking of TikTok in that instance, but it's not the only example. And broader sort of question of interruption of supply chains and financial instability. And I think onto the final slide, please. Really, this is, for Southeast Asia, as much as anywhere else, this is raising questions as to where companies can sit and whether they're in a position to actually keep their head below the parapet. And I've thrown a Thailand counterfactual into the mix here. Thailand obviously is undergoing a number of protests at the moment, not as severe as in the past, as in 2014 or 2010, but noteworthy in that we've had a quiet period before. It's a treaty partner of the US, but it also deals closely with the PRC. The sort of contention I'm posing here is if the student discontent at the monarchy and at the military government gets out of hand, it's not unfeasible that we would be looking at a return to violence as in May 2010. And in those circumstances, it may be that Western states are forced to disengage from Thailand. Certainly in the States, for instance, there are laws in place which, for instance, curtail military aid to formally labeled dictatorships, say, which obviously Thailand's made a transition back to democracy now. But that provides opportunities for parties from outside the countries to see things in proxy terms. And of course, this has big implications for business. It ignores the nuance of the place. But the parallel I draw here is the 2011 floods in Thailand, where I believe it was the fans in almost every laptop or hard drive in the world, and they were all produced in flood-ridden areas of Thailand. And so you learn quite quickly how vulnerable those supply networks are. This is illustrative rather than anything else, but I wanted to contextualize it, say what we're operating in is not something isolated to just Hong Kong or even to mainland China, but is now broadening out with quite serious regional implications. I'll finish there. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Alex, who I believe is next. He's going to talk about broader issues.
Well, thank you very much, Kit, and thank you to Michael and the Chamber for inviting me. It's a great honour and privilege to join you, and thanks to Julian for his very kind introduction. I'm going to broaden out the discussion a little bit from Hong Kong to wider China concerns, focusing on what I'm describing as China's new assertiveness and implications for regional political violence. A lot of debate at the moment is about whether or not a new Cold War is happening. I don't think so. I think China is too inextricably enmeshed in the global economy to be compared to a Cold War. But China wants to promote a new and improved system of global governance with Chinese characteristics, which it describes as the China Plan. And with this comes a renewed drive to protect what are described as China's core interests. The Chinese strategic community acknowledged that bilateral relations with America are now at their worst in 41 years. And meanwhile, Chinese military spending has increased dramatically over the last 10 years. So are we facing a slide into crisis? Well, I do think there's a dangerous mix of pressure points on China's core interests, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, the India border recently, Taiwan, and of course, Hong Kong. Meanwhile, next year, it's the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party next year. And there's also debate about whether or not Xi Jinping at the 20th Party Congress in 2022 will actually become an indefinite leader into the future rather than stepping down. So rewinding a bit, 20 years in fact, my early career was punctuated by two events. The Belgrade embassy bombing, China's embassy in Belgrade in 1999, and the Hainan Island collision in 2001, when a Chinese fighter jet collided with a US signals intelligence aircraft. The common characteristic of these events was, firstly, China's crisis management mechanisms were poorly understood. And secondly, Beijing orchestrated protests against Western interests. So almost 20 years ago, Chinese fighter interceptor collided with this intelligence aircraft. The Chinese fighter pilot Huang was killed in the incident. Instead of ditching, the US commander of the aircraft chose to make a forced landing on a Chinese Air Force airfield on Hainan Island. And one of the key observations from that dramatic episode were considerable gaps in understanding of how China's leadership managed escalation. And unfortunately, this concern lingers today, and I think the stakes are much higher. So if there were to be an incident in the East or South China Sea, at sea or in the air, how quickly could China react and what would be the response? I think there's the potential for widespread protests in China and beyond if that sort of incident were to take place. We know now that China wields considerable political influence capabilities across the Asia-Pacific region, and in particular within Chinese communities across Asia. For the audience, I think it's important to note that the UK is sending a carrier strike group to this region next summer. And I think companies should consider the impacts should there unfortunately be any escalation during this tour across Asia. So I talked about my earlier career. Fast forward 20 years, what are we looking at? Well, there's tension all along China's periphery. I've mentioned the South China Sea. There are tensions with Vietnam, recently with Indonesia, with Japan, and with Taiwan, and of course on the India-China border. US concerns about China's more assertive behaviors are really about the relative inexperience of a newer generation of commanders operating sophisticated weapon systems. And what if one of these leaders does not keep to the script and becomes more aggressive? So some case studies. back in May the 1st, 2014, the China National Offshore Oil Company sent an oil rig deep into Vietnam's claimed exclusive economic zone. Chinese and Vietnamese vessels harassed one another intensely for several weeks, and it became the closest that Hanoi and Beijing have come to a confrontation since a very bloody incident over Johnson's South Reef in the South China Sea in 1988. Protests across Vietnam broke out. Protesters targeted Chinese factories in industrial parks, and a Taiwanese factory was mistakenly torched as well before the authorities could get a grip. More recently, Indonesia. Indonesia's stance against Beijing is hardening. And this is with a backdrop on recurrent anti-Chinese sentiment periodically. Indonesia's maritime forces shadowed the Chinese Coast Guard ship, which had intruded into Indonesia's exclusive economic zone for 2 days. And the incident occurred off Indonesia's Natuna Islands and is the latest of numerous incursions into its exclusive economic zone by Chinese Coast Guard ships and fishing vessels. And on 14th of September, Indonesia made a formal diplomatic protest to Beijing. Japan. Japan has complained of increasing incursions by the Chinese Navy and Air Force in its waters adjacent to the East China Sea. Back in 2012, the Tokyo government purchased the Senkaku Islands. It was a private purchase, which are disputed with China, who calls them the Diaoyuda. This prompted 2 waves of rather violent protests across China, and quite often they were violent against all kinds of Japanese interests. Taiwan. Short of encouraging Taiwanese independence, the US is pushing as far as possible up to Beijing's red line, testing China's elastic limit. The Trump administration will therefore set a threshold for China's tolerance levels, which may be pursued by the next US administration. And if things continue to deteriorate, there's always the potential for protests in mainland China as well as in Taiwan. Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone and across the median line have increased in frequency. And Taiwan's Air Force reported that 16 fighter jets, 2 bombers and 1 patrol aircraft made incursions into Taiwan's airspace on the 19th of September. Finally, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of tensions on China's periphery is India. China-India relations have become increasingly adversarial in the last 5 years. The tipping point for India was China's pressure on multiple points along the line of actual control, the line between, the demarcation between China and India, and the change of the definition of that line of actual control, and then that precipitated the fatal Galwan clash. The strategic community in India appears to be unified in the view that in the wake of the Galwan Valley clash, there's been an irreversible deterioration in India-China relations. India has reciprocated China's military reinforcements. Indian deployments in eastern Ladakh have more than doubled from the usual about 30,000 troops stationed in the region. And there have been a couple of firing incidents across the line of control. So this begs the question, is there going to be further escalation? Could this precipitate more communal violence in India? And it also begs the question of the possibility of spillover into Jammu Kashmir, which is a perennial flashpoint right next door. So finally, I've asked the question, are we in a Cold War, a new Cold War? Probably not. But China is complaining of containment by the so-called Five Eyes allies, as well as a new one, the Quadrilateral alignment between Australia, the US, Japan, and India. But I do think there is a potential for unmanaged escalation and a crisis slide, which could prompt protests in the region. Unfortunately, China's strategic community is consistently messaging about the potential for war. But I think also really important is China and ASEAN member states, particularly the claimants in the South China Sea, their ability for crisis management. And next year, the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party is going to be a very sensitive one. Thank you very much.
Hi all, good afternoon. My name is Carrie Huang from AXA Excel, and I'm based in Singapore. Thanks, Kit and Alex, for your briefings, really informative. I'm very delighted today, really have this opportunity to share my view for this topic, really from the risk solution and insurance angle. Next slide, please, Helen. And the next one, thank you. Yeah, so if I remember back to the year end of 2019, we held a beer at the bar and said, wow, what a chaotic year that we had. If you remember, we heard the really serious terrorism attack in Sri Lanka during the Easter Sunday, when 5-star hotels were hit with massive casualty then. We then heard about the rioting situation and the looting activities in South America, especially in Chile. Also, clearly, Hong Kong made itself as a headline during the different waves of social unrest since last June. We thought that we could conclude that 2019 is a global unrest year. However, 2020 is getting worse. Many people now blame the COVID-19 as a key contributor to all the mess now. Well, we think COVID-19 is just an accelerator. It just triggered many pre-existing stress points, clearly. Hong Kong is a continued phase from 2019, and US, well, has had the racism issue far before the Black Lives Matter events. The Thailand people didn't really seem happy for many years already before they had this latest wave of protests on the street. In more recent weeks, we have seen and saw terrible news on many other parts of the world, and the latest one is the headline made in the Central Asia area. Well, over the upcoming month this year and next, many governments in the world will be judged clearly on how well they balanced the need to tackle a health system, health emergency, and the efforts to keep the economy growing and keep the people happy. For those of you looking to understand the risk that this balancing act poses to their global supply chains, this is really the time to seriously consider geopolitical risk. Among all those, don't forget that terrorism risk has not gone away. They simply paused. You should know that even ISIS organization issued an internal letters to their fighters in the war to stay home just to avoid the virus. Overall, this year we can see we are in a messier year. Helen, next slide, please. Oh, sorry, this is the slide that I'm going to speak on. Yeah, thank you. Next, I want to share more with you the impact on those global unrest towards the insurance market and our clients. Basically, I want to say that what do all those unrest mean for you and your business? Globally, losses from the protests in Chile last year are expected to cost insurance market between 3 to 4 billion US dollars. They are primarily picked up by property insurance market, clearly, and also political risk market. Those are just insurance loss. The actual financial impact, financial loss are a lot bigger than that. Back in Asia, notable market events was again the Sri Lanka attack last year. One of our clients in Asia is a hotel sector client, suffered serious physical damage loss, and actually also business interruption loss as well from that attack. In the later part of 2019 that we just heard about the Hong Kong issue, clearly insurance loss in Hong Kong has been piling up, and those losses falling into both property insurance market and our market, our political violence and terrorism market as well. We've seen losses happen in Hong Kong, in retail sectors, in transportation, also government assets. In general, when we review all those insurance claim files, clearly business interruption loss seems to be a bigger portion of the entire paying of the insurance loss. As a result, insurance rate, particularly on this area, is going up clearly. And particularly in Hong Kong, and this was unseen in the past for many, many years. One of our business partner, which is a broker in this region, they recorded a 54.5% renewal rate increase this year in the first quarter. Our data also aligned this trending clearly, and the range of rate increase range as well. We have seen in this region more and more of our clients looking into their risk management solution and proposal. Many of our clients started to understand the market trending and the market condition a bit more. And they now realizing that the market is changing, it's turning. They have to really consider a lot of factors far before renewal time. Clearly, cost is going up to obtain the similar coverage now, and some free or easy cover, for example, like strike, riot, civil commotions kind of coverage, which they used to get easily from the market, from property, etc., are now being stripped out from the property market. And a lot of the risk managers suddenly realizing more and more coverage gaps in between various policies. And demand for standalone specific political violence insurance policy are growing as a result. Risk managers are concerned about the coverage gap during the renewal negotiation and also business processing period. And they're actively seeking for solutions. Another notable trend in Asia or this region for us is more and more of our clients, especially when they operate not only in one country, in one territory, they have their business presence in the world everywhere, they are more seriously considering a proper standalone global program set up for the terrorism and PV risk. It is really definitely a more professional field that our market to consider and come up with a solution. And this is also fulfill your need from the compliance and legal perspective on this area. So I'm going to pass the ground to Matt Bird, who's going to talk about more in terms of insurance solution on this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. That's very kind, and thank you, Alex and Kit, as well. I think that you obviously seen some great insights from the three previous speakers and their views on the potential risks that there are out there at the moment. As Carrie mentioned, I'm going to be looking at a little bit more of the on the insurance technical side and what potential solutions there are out there for you with regards to insurance coverage. I think from what the people have been saying is that one of the things most people think is that it's not going to happen to me, but the fact is you don't have to be the target to be the victim. You could be collateral damage, or you could just be caught up in the situations that are happening at the moment, and it's better to obviously have a backup plan for that, and not be left in the lurch. That could potentially be damaging to your companies. So I guess the message is, you do really need to manage your risk and to make sure that you've got some coverage in place for this. Carrie touched upon it. There are generally two places where this might be found. You may have some coverage in your all risks or property policy, or where Carrie and I come from, we have the standalone political violence market. And it was mentioned before that until the unfortunate events of 9/11, there wasn't a standalone market, but this has now been 20 years in the making. And unfortunately, we've been seeing more regular occurrences of terrorism and political violence within the world. And it's not something that I think we can ignore anymore. So I guess the question you need to ask yourself is, is the cover, if you have cover, is it appropriate? Have you looked at the perils that are included within your property policy if you don't buy a standalone policy? In an all risks policy, quite often the coverage is limited. The definitions may not be quite as sound and as secure as in the standalone market. Quite often, obviously, in the property policies, you're only looking at coverage for strikes, riots, and civil commotion. As we know, there's definitely more risk out there than just those basic ones. So the idea is, if you only have some coverage in your property, is that enough? If you have property and a PV, that enough? Because often people will look and say, I've got SRCC in my property policy and I've got a standalone terrorism coverage as well, but what about the broader perils? So I think those are all the sorts of things that you need to be asking yourself on that. And I'm guessing if you have a look at any insurance policies you've got and you realise you don't have any cover, then maybe time to act quite quickly and see what you can do about it, and consult your broker as to what you might be able to do about that. They will be able to help you understand your exposures and the potential covers that you require. Obviously, very key at the moment is obviously budget. The socio-economic situation with COVID and everything means that purse strings are tight, and it is difficult to maybe find money for buying a potential coverage that you haven't been purchasing in the past. But I do think it was, as the other three have highlighted, quite important to be looking at that. And there are a number of ways of working out how much coverage, what coverage you might need. You can blend it with the different coverages you might feel that you need, the size of limits that you might buy, the deductibles that you have, and the exposure. You may have a number of assets in one country, one asset in a number of different countries. Obviously in a higher risk or perceived to be higher risk territories than others. So you may choose not to insure all your locations, or if so you've got some locations in the central business district that may be of higher risk for, say a situation in Hong Kong that's happened with a lot of property damage to shop fronts and all that sort of stuff, but you may have warehouses, further afield that you don't feel that you need to cover. So there are plenty of ways of managing your budget spend while still getting some coverage that you would make you feel comfortable having on that front. So Helen, if we could move on to the next slide, that would be great. So I guess, obviously, Carrie and I come from the standalone market. We're very passionate about the coverages that we offer. It's, I think, becoming more and more prevalent, every year that we go on. And I think COVID has probably highlighted the situation as much as anything. Now, obviously, COVID is not a direct threat to a policy that we offer with political violence, but it's very much an indirect situation where, with low incomes, people losing jobs, distress caused from, belief of what the government is or isn't doing correctly, all causes potential issues with regards to, the things that Carrie touched on and the others, with Chile, with the US, with the Black Lives Matter and all the rioting that's happened there, and obviously closer to home here in Hong Kong. So why do we believe that buying a standalone policy is best? Well, firstly, as we say, the property market, since the situation that's happened recently around the world, have been scaling back, if not excluding, the coverage that you may have had. Now, it may seem as though the cover you had was for free, but obviously it is it is taken into consideration when you're paying your premium or getting charged your premiums for these. So there does come a cost at a standalone policy, but we believe that it is absolutely worth it. You know, with the standalone market, you're dealing with specialist brokers, specialist underwriters, dedicated claims handlers. You know, one of probably the most important things that we offer with regards to the insurance is not just the coverage, it is how quickly we can understand your issues and pay those claims that you might need to have, so you can get yourself back up and running as quickly as you can. We also, obviously, with what we do, have access to specialist risk consultants that would be able to help provide, you know, very useful insight into how you can maybe mitigate against these risks a little bit better, do maybe bomb blast analyses or property damage analysis to see what could be your potential maximum loss. Another way that you can work out maybe how much exposure and how much coverage that you might want to buy. I think as well, I touched on it earlier, I think with the standalone market, you have a much wider array of perils that you know are on offer and that you need to consider. You know, we start off with sabotage and terrorism policy, which does exactly what it says. It covers you against any acts of terrorism, and then we move on to maybe what's happening, been more happening recently with regards to the strikes, riots, civil commotion, malicious damage coverage, and then we obviously move on to the slightly more sort of scary areas where we've got rebellion, revolution, insurrection, coup, and potentially wars and civil wars that you know, since 2010 and Arab Spring and everything else that went on has been, you know, happening at far more regularity than obviously any of us would like to, you know, have. I think with regards to the standalone market as well, you know, we can tailor wordings to you specifically. They're just not standard. We have standard wordings, they work very, very well, but sometimes different clients have different needs and all that sort of stuff. So therefore, we can sit down. We do this every day, and we work with you to find a solution for you with regards to how much you have premium spend and how much exposure you need, or how much exposure you feel you have, to give you that degree of comfort that if something were unfortunately to happen, you know, you do have the mitigation for that. I believe the other thing that's you know, great that we can offer as well, and you know, so we're thinking to all the time of how we can improve the offerings that we have for you. A lot of the attacks we've seen when it comes to the terrorism side, or you know, a lot of the lone wolf attacks that you see in the States are occurring more and more often around the world. So other coverages that we believe are you know very prevalent in today's situation is the active assailant coverage, where you know it may be more difficult to define why they're doing it in some cases, and not just it's not just a terrorism act, and obviously generally the triggers for any loss on our coverage is physical damage. Whereas actually a lot of the ISIS attacks that have occurred and the lone wolf, there's not a lot of property damage, but there's a lot of you know, obviously fatality and a lot of cost that can be occurred with regards to that sort of situation. So that's something else that we can offer as part of an overall policy, or even as a standalone active assailant policy. Terrorism liability is also something that we offer as a consideration. Often in a liability, a general liability policy, terrorism, for example, is either excluded, you know, absolutely specifically excluded, or it's silent within the wording, and people may interpret that two ways: that if it's silent, it's included, or if it's silent, you know, do we know if we ever get to a situation that we need to test it out, what will the court say? Well, if you buy a terrorism liability policy, then you know you've got the coverage for that. And obviously, I guess slightly linked with active assailant, you've got your non-damage BI, which I've sort of touched on. Generally, you need a physical trigger for a policy to go, but obviously we can give elements of non-damage business interruption, as well as denial of access. You know, you may not have been hit yourself, or you may not have been caught up with a particular strike or riot or civil commotion that's going on, but it obviously prevents you getting access to your property, and you're losing revenue due to that, and so obviously that can be covered as well on that front. So I guess the overall message from us in the standalone political violence market is this coverage that we offer is not an afterthought, and it's not lost within a property policy that offers a huge amount of different perils that maybe are more prevalent for them, and not so much for us. So therefore, I think the message is, come and talk to us, and we can work something that suits you. And on that front, I think that's all from me there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Alex and Kit, for your useful insights. We're now moving across to the Q&A section. So if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A tab and send them through. We'll look at them and ask the questions. There were some great presentations there. I think there was a lot of food for thought. What I'd like to, if I may, very quickly ask, and this is really directed to Kit more than anyone else, who was talking about the situation in Hong Kong and the likely financial sanctions that are coming down the line against businesses in China, Hong Kong. Does he see that having a direct impact on the security situation in Hong Kong or China? Kit, over to you.
Well, my immediate instinct is that the security situation in Hong Kong has, from the perspective, the neutral perspective of business, it has improved. Because without a doubt, there's just much less risk in terms of protest damage. However, the operational environment has changed markedly, and that poses new challenges to business, which has been accustomed to dealing in Hong Kong as if they were dealing in other Western capitals, say New York or London or Paris. And so in terms of sort of the operational realities of the place, that has changed and markedly. I think Carrie Lam declared the other day that she had restored stability. I think it's hard to read the situation in full. I mean, one point I would make is that the numbers at protests have diminished very markedly. Very markedly. The 1st of October was a much smaller event, and there was a very large police presence. I think some 6,000 police were deployed across the city in order to prevent a recurrence of the sort of instability that followed after last year's 1st of October event. So I think in that sort of very plain sense, the security situation is sounder. Whether that's a combination of the national security law deterring people and or COVID keeping people away, I couldn't tell you what proportion it is. But I do think there's a sense that the situation has changed, at least for the near term.
Thanks, Kit. Yes, I think that was the point I was getting to. Is are these additional pressures going to cause, be inflammatory and cause further unrest? Or, and I think this is really your message, has the security situation improved, not necessarily for the betterment of the people of Hong Kong, but certainly through an increased level of increased police presence and a firmer grip from the local and central government. I don't know if anyone else on the panel wants to comment on Hong Kong particularly. I saw that we did have a question for Carrie regarding the Festival Walk attack. I say attack, I think that's the question, isn't it? We're asking, was it a political act? I think it's certainly a very sensitive issue. And Carrie, you can decline to answer it if it's going to potentially put you in a difficult position.
Well, I don't mind outlining a couple of notes on that case. What I can say is it's a really good classic case study. If we have gone through that like a couple of years later, like where we are on the Thailand rioting in the central world more now, this Hong Kong case could be a really good textbook case study. Anyway, so for all those who's interested, I'm not going to spend more time on the incident itself or the details of it. And what I can actually share, it's quite limited because this case, we are involved, AXA XL is involved, AXA Group is involved, and it also involved different type of contract on this case as well. We are subject to various confidentiality agreement with the client, with various parties as well. So bear me if I can't say much, but what I would like to say is this case, if you refer to the incident before last Christmas, when a couple of nights the mall was hit in Hong Kong, including the lovely Christmas tree was set in fire, basically. It's a case with complicated background, and I can say the insurance market as a whole, evolving different product line, worked very hard. And we are now at the stage of presenting a solution for the client as a collective effort. And I believe that this is an effort that different part of the market pays really make together, different market carriers, different type of coverage, and different contract party as well. In terms of this question, it reads a bit it's not really a straight answer for that, to be honest. I can also share that based on the investigation outcome, based on many rounds of discussion with the client, and based on actual proof that we obtained in our hand, it's a mixed background, a mixed motivation among the reasonings for this case. So it's not a direct or single reason for that. It's a mix of reasoning, a mix of motivation. And this case proved again that our policy is based on proof of fact. We are not judging the case or the nature of case by just reading on the newspaper or just by reading some posts on the social media or simply judging from the government or police angle. As a contract, as a commercial contract, we look at the proof of fact. So I'm not sure I gave you a good answer on that. And again, this is basically some highlighter on that case.
I think it's a great answer. And all I would add to that is the fact that what I think Matt was talking about and promoting, and Carrie, I know you share this, is that business need to start thinking about broader form political violence, something that's all embracing. Typically in the past, post 9/11, and probably before that even, it's been a little bit one-dimensional. We've just thought about terrorism, we've just reacted to the terrorism threat. Of course, that cost the insurance industry and it cost business billions of dollars post 9/11. It was an extraordinary event. And that's what everyone has been fixated on for probably 20 odd years. But more recently, we're seeing this shift in landscape from your standard run-of-the-mill, nothing run-of-the-mill about terrorism, but I'm sure you get my idea. Everyone's been so fixated on terrorism that we've sort of forgotten that actually there's a lot more out there that can cause us issues. We did have the Bangkok riots in 2010, which was a big payout for the market. And then more recently, we've seen the significant events in Chile, which I don't think anyone expected. And then, of course, the Hong Kong riots have been ongoing for some time. Now we've entered into this new world order where COVID-19 is ever present all over the world, putting huge strain on the local and regional economies. and probably inordinate strain on those emerging markets across Asia. And I'm thinking about the Philippines, Indonesia, and countries like that. We begin to see, and I know, and I was going to bring this across to Alex, actually. Alex was touching on recent unrest in Thailand, and I think only yesterday in Indonesia, which was protesting against proposed changes in labour laws, liberalisation of labour laws, I believe. Alex, to you, are these events that we're seeing in Thailand, in Indonesia, in any way underscored by the economic impact of COVID-19, or do you think they're totally unrelated? And before you answer that, I would also like to say, and looking at the riots we've been seeing in the US, how much of Black Lives Matter and all those riots was actually underscored by a desperate situation in the economy? Would the spark have been quite so inflammatory if it hadn't been underscored by an economic crisis perpetuated by COVID-19? Alex, to you.
Julian, thanks. I think you may have been referring to Kit there. Kit did mention the Indonesia and Thailand.
Sorry, apologies.
That's okay, but I mean, I'll hand over to Kit in a second, but I think on the question of COVID-19, I think it's a catalyst. It's an underlying causer of anxiety, and of course there are major economic discrepancies across different countries in the Asia Pacific. So whilst the COVID pandemic itself might not be a direct trigger for mass unrest, I think it can serve as a catalyst or a force multiplier for other political problems, and because large swathes of populations across the region have kind of been suppressed because of lockdowns. As countries open up in a gradually post-COVID world, we hope, that maybe as the pressure valve comes off, that could prompt unrest associated with COVID. On Thailand and Indonesia, I'll ask. I think that was Kit who mentioned them.
Kit, do you want to respond? And apologies for muddling the two presentations up.
No, cool. I mean, I think I largely agree with Alex, actually. I mean, I think that the virus has clearly left people adrift and questioning and anxious. But one of the questions I've been mulling over is quite whether we've seen it through yet, and whether we actually just haven't seen the implications of what COVID-19 means. Because for me, the health impact and the political legitimacy impact is obviously important, but equally important is the economic story. And there's always a lag. We're really only now beginning to see the large-scale layoffs that we'd expect to see. And historically in Southeast Asia, when you've seen those sorts of downturns, and they've not happened readily, but it's now, I think, growing at the slowest pace since '97, you have seen a good degree of turmoil, often on the streets and often extremely nasty. I'm thinking particularly of the anti-Chinese riots in 1998 in Indonesia, but there have been other illustrations as well. And it may be that sort of the economic implications haven't yet filtered through. That was the point. That was the point I'd like to make in that context.
Thanks, Kit. There's a question on the Q&A section to Kit. Alex, it says, given the recent and well-publicized Social Dilemma documentary, how much do you think social media has instigated security challenges and or perpetuated circumstances? Or do you think social media is often used as an excuse and used as a manipulation tool? that's quite a far-reaching question. Alex, do you want to, Kit's just spoken, so maybe you can jump in here. And Kit, if you want to add something, please feel free at the end.
Sure. I think we've all been, been gripped by the presidential campaign in the US, and when Trump was elected, of course, that whole campaign was riddled with accusations of misinformation campaigns, fake news, and so on. But one more recent example, I think, is the potential in India, which is a rapacious consumer of social media platforms. There's a lot of fake news going on there about China's activities on the border, about Indian troop activities. Quite often, imagery or data will be pulled from some years ago and be promoted as activities that are ongoing. So I think there is a possibility with fake news to exacerbate a situation. So we've got a very tense situation on the India-China border. I think Indian society is very susceptible to stoking up communal violence using social media, and that can be in the northeastern states of India, but sometimes it can just be communal violence where lynchings take place of innocent bystanders. When it comes to manipulation, I think one good example is the last Taiwanese presidential election, where there was a real online onslaught from so-called patriotic hackers and posters. Chinese, sometimes they're called Hongke, but really hammering Taiwanese networks with information designed to bring discredit to President Tsai Ing-wen. That's a good example, I think, there. But I suppose the Great Firewall of China and domestic censorship means that China's got quite a steely grip on social media posting, whereas if you juxtapose that with India, which has an incredibly vibrant and energetic social media environment, those are, you can compare and contrast those two countries.
Kit, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Just one small point, which is, I do think the social media has assisted in organisation of protests and various groups in a way that was just not true, both by drawing together fringe elements who previously would have been 1 in 100, and so they've been unable really to readily contact one another. But it was illustrative in terms of the orchestration of the Hong Kong protests, where there was a great deal of reliance on Telegram and other measures, and they were useful for organising pop-up protests. And as soon as the police arrived, people could immediately message out, and people would appear then in other locales. So in that sense, I think it does facilitate activism, whether that then moves into violence. I mean, it probably does in terms of extremism and in terms of terrorism. I'm sure it does. But whether that's a sea change, I don't know. I mean, each generation tends to be very arrogant and assume that it's never been done before. And obviously the tools have changed, but in terms of acceleration of ideas, this is akin perhaps to the spread of the printing press in 16th century Europe, which obviously is different in nature and speed, but it's comparable at any rate.
Fantastic, thank you. Very interesting. Maybe we can direct some questions to our underwriter colleagues on the panel, Carrie and Matthew. I'd just like to get a sense from you, from an underwriter perspective, regarding the current social economic climate and the concerns that I think we all have, we're seeing a general hardening of the insurance market. It's not just, I'm not talking about just political violence and terrorism, we're talking about the whole remit of insurance, whether or not it's property damage or casualty insurance. We're seeing hardening rates, we're seeing increased prices, in part a reaction to the economic climate. What is happening in the political violence world? Are we seeing a general hardening of rates? Are you specifically looking for increased rates and premiums in specific areas? And I guess that segues into a question around where do you think the hotspots are as an underwriter in Asia today? Hong Kong was very much on the radar in 2019. You've already mentioned that, I think Kit and Alex have both mentioned that that's quietened down for not necessarily the right reasons, but it has because of COVID-19. But as we emerge from COVID-19, as COVID-19 has this impact on society across the region, I would imagine that you have a specific view that specific territories, specific countries, specific areas are more susceptible to riots flaring up, civil unrest flaring up than others. Do you want to talk about that and maybe give us an idea about what you consider to be the political violence hotspots for 2021?
I'm happy to go here, Carrie. Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, most of the insurance market is hardening on a number of classes of business, and I think that historically the PV market has maybe gone in a slightly different direction from the rest of the market. Obviously, peak highs of rates were obviously straight after 9/11, and when there wasn't really a market and it was a bit of a panic, and you've probably seen rates reducing ever since then. Maybe arguably to an affordable rate for people to buy in a number of regions, etc. Then we've had the odd spike where I think with other classes of insurance, if there are lots of large losses, that generally has an effect on the whole class of business across the world. Whereas I think with PV, we are definitely more isolated in our rating. If we have witnessed losses in a particular region, yes, we will be seeing rate rises there, but they wouldn't necessarily affect somewhere that hasn't had any issues whatsoever or doesn't have any perceived risk to it. I guess that's maybe more on a standard S&T scenario, but I think with the current situation that we are having now, where there are a lot more civil commotions going on and a lot of issues with the populations, with regards to their governments, etc. So have we seen a hardening of the market? We've probably seen a flattening out of the market. I would say reductions are definitely fewer and further between than they used to be. Rates, as we know, did increase in Hong Kong, or have done and remain to do. I think people are still cautious and waiting to see what happens, and some people have suffered losses there, so therefore that's a watching brief on what they've done there. Obviously, we witnessed the tragic events in Sri Lanka last April, and we saw a spike in the rates in Sri Lanka at the time, but then quite quickly they came back down again. So I think the market reacts quickly to an event and reacts quickly if there isn't an ongoing issue there. But capital is tight. Everything is tight within all countries due to COVID. So there is pressure on us to be increasing our rates if we can. Yes.
Well said. Matt, and I can probably add in a couple more points around your comments as well. And clearly, we talk about insurance loss, and when insurance suffer many losses in the classes, insurance market is expecting some return. I mean, and more importantly, overall, in terms of the entire insurance market, the cost of capital is higher, definitely higher. So this is a separate point on top of the insurance loss that we'll have to recover, of course. In terms of cost of capital, we look at probably tighter alternative capital in the market, injection in the market. We're really looking into the year end when a lot of insurance market is renewing their treaty behind the book. We're also reviewing what is the refreshed terms and internal guidance of underwriting from the mainstream market as well. So putting all those factors together, I would say that 2021 or 2022 will be definitely a changing market for PVT market. We're not saying exactly the same rate increase with casualty or the energy or property guys, but the market is changing and market conditions changing as well. And I also want to put up a couple of dry facts there. And I know that COVID-19 and a changing market will definitely have impact on our clients' budget as well. When a lot of the clients basically just plan similar budget from previous historical record, and they realize that probably they don't have enough budget or enough funding pool to afford a similar coverage anymore. And this is the ugly fact that we have seen basically every single week, that client cannot afford a increased cost of coverage anymore. And a lot of like client probably just try to lapse the coverage in such a difficult situation. It's the ugly fact, but the common concern about lapsing coverage or not taking up proper insurance solution is you probably lose opportunity of obtaining at least the basic minimum coverage in the market trend. And it's probably a long-term harm to the client as well, because when you have the chance to come back, and a lot of market like PVT market, they may be running out of the aggregate cap from that country, from that city, from that single building. It's probably a more technical term, but that could be the case that you cannot have a sustainable risk solution from the market anymore. And and another thing is, looking forward to 2021 onward, I also foresee that engaging with your risk consultant, engaging with the insurance market carriers, professionals is really important. Have a proactive dialogue with your consultant, broker market. Really have a real understanding on what's going on, rather than just make a rush, simple decision when the renewal day is coming up. I guess this is a couple of my views on the notes to the audience.
Very good. Very quick question from me, and I know we're getting close to the end now. Really directed to Carrie and Matt, who are very eloquent there. With all the changes in Hong Kong, so last year it was all about Hong Kong. This year we've seen the riots, the civil disturbances ebb away, in part because of COVID-19 locking down the city, in part because of enhanced security measures. Can my clients, can businesses expect substantial rate reductions for civil unrest and terrorism in Hong Kong going forward? Can I deliver that good news to them tomorrow?
Well, I probably lay out a couple of the points already to that answer, and I don't think it's realistic to expect a suddenly rate drop for Hong Kong next year. The market may take more time to rebalancing, to refresh the capacity and cost of capital, etc. So I know the Hong Kong client probably encounter rate rise last year until now, but I don't think the market could support a sudden drop in rate perspective. So
the brokers are going to work extra hard to achieve these.
Yeah. You have to deliver some proactive message out.
Got it. Matt, did you want to add anything there? Then I've got one final question.
No, I would concur with Carrie there. I think it's a bit too soon to be that optimistic, Julian, I'm afraid.
Okay. Well, it's not necessarily the news my clients wanted to hear. Very quickly to Alex and Kit. We've been talking a lot about social unrest, political unrest, and the impact on businesses. We've been talking a lot about the insurance solutions offered for that. Have we taken our eye off the ball from the more traditional terrorism type events? Have they, with onset of COVID-19 and the pressures that's had, we haven't seen so much terrorist activity and outside of the Middle East, of course. So across Asia, we saw the terrible events in Sri Lanka last Easter, last Easter, I should say. But it's been relatively quiet across Asia since then. We haven't seen a huge amount of activity in the Philippines per se. That's taken a back seat, I think. Can we expect more in the future, or are we going to see a different kind of dynamic in 2021 and beyond? Kit, Alex, either one of you?
On the terrorism question, I mean, I think terrorists, like everybody else, have had their activities constrained. But I would, and also their fundraising capabilities as well. That's an important one. But I wonder whether it's just a function of our attention being turned rather than, consistent existential threats from terrorism across the region. I think what I would say is that these lockdowns and retrenchment and so on may have offered opportunities for terrorist groups to regroup, hunker down, reform, reevaluate their strategies. I think, as I mentioned earlier about the Indian border question, I mean, we're still seeing quite regular incursions in Jammu and Kashmir, for example. I just wonder whether it's the pace and frequency of reporting of terrorism has taken second stage to reporting on COVID.
Good points. Kit, can you add to that?
No, I think I agree. I think the problem is still with us, but it may be just that the risk environment has worsened in so many other ways. Was once a sort of core risk, is now more of a sort of fringe risk, but it remains as problematic, I think, as it was in the past. Obviously, the decline in aviation and that sort of thing limits what they can do at the moment, but I can't see why those extremist ideologies would scale back their intentions. If anything, it's arguable that at a time of broader instability elsewhere, owing to China-US relations declining or whatever else, it provides opportunities.
Yeah, thank you, Kit. I agree. I think that the one thing that my time in this business has taught me is that the situation can change in a hairpin. 2 years ago, we couldn't have imagined the situation in Hong Kong. We couldn't have imagined the situation we saw in Chile. I don't think the Black Lives Matter movement and those widespread riots in America were something we'd consider. And indeed, COVID-19 itself, I don't think anyone could have foreseen the impact that that's had on the world, on the global economy, and on social and political pressures. I think we're getting very close to the end. I think at this point I should begin to wind this up. I want to thank everybody on the panel. I think it's been very interesting, very insightful topics that were covered. I think the presentations from all the panelists were fantastic. They handled the questions with aplomb, some trickier than others. I don't know if there's any final comments from any of you before we move on. We need to hand back to Michael at BritCham before we go. But if there's anyone who wants to say any final words, this is your opportunity. Carrie, I see you've taken mute off, so maybe you wanted to say something.
Oh, I just accidentally keep my unmute out. I think I make some final comment already, just advices to the audience. And yeah, some of them are actually our clients. I can see the name of that. But yeah, this is actually really my input on the outlook of 2021-2022.
Great, thank you. So thank you once again, all the panelists, and thank you to BritCham for hosting. At this point, I'd like to hand back to Michael.
Thanks very much, Julian. Well, very, very quickly, on behalf of the Chamber, huge thank you to all our speakers, Kit, Alex, Carrie and Matt, for giving us your time, analysis and also practical tips today, and also particularly to Julian for his moderation, and to Helen and the team for organising. Now, before you dive for that leave button in the bottom right of your screens, can I ask you for 30 seconds on what else is coming up at the Chamber? So next week, we're very excited to invite the explorer Grant Wallinson back to us to deliver another interactive leadership experience, putting you in the mind of the explorer and trying your hand actually in real time at making decisions that have extreme outcomes. And that's from his human-powered adventure from Singapore to New Zealand. Also, please join us on the 22nd of October, where we're going to be discussing and perhaps as an extension of today's discussion, the upcoming US elections and their impact on the UK from another esteemed panel comprising Cadence, Control Risks, ING and OMFIF. And after this morning's debate, I'm sure it should be one that we should definitely attend. And finally, please may I ask you to take a few seconds to fill in a very simple feedback form, which we'll be emailing to you after we finish. Your feedback is very important to get this right. And finally, from Singapore, thank you very much again for joining us at the British Chamber. Please stay safe and thank you very much for joining.